It takes a village to raise a child. Who here has heard that proverb before? Pretty good one, right? It's one of my favorites. This proverb is an African proverb, and it predates everything. It predates me, it predates you, it predates all of this. In fact, it even predates slavery, when in the 15th century, Europeans descended upon parts of West Africa and took over 12 million black Africans as slaves, transported them via the Caribbean to North America, where they were kept for over 300 years as property and not as humans. Through struggle, through colonization, through slavery, marginalization, and oppression, somehow this proverb still holds strong, still manages to unite black communities and black diasporas. So this is me. I have many titles, many labels, but most profoundly, I consider myself a community builder. That's something that's really important to me, something that I'm so passionate about. In my community building work, I have one key philosophy that I think it's so essential to stick by, and that's intersectionality. Now, I know that's a big word, maybe a bit of a buzzword, and I'm going to come back to it later. But first, what I'm going to try to do is use my own personal experience to explain what it means. So, I am black, and I am queer. For most of my life, I was told by media, by history, by education, by social circles, that black people could only be straight and queer people could only be white. I thought you had to be Ellen DeGeneres or nothing else. I didn't know that I could exist. So when I started university, and I think anyone who's been to university or moved to a new city or a new place knows that when you arrive, it's an opportunity to reinvent yourself, to introduce yourself as something new or as something maybe you've always been hiding. And so I took that opportunity. I really wanted to learn more about my African and Caribbean ancestry. I wanted to learn more about how people from different black communities and African descent collaborated and communicated with one another. So I joined the Black Student Union on campus. This is one of the first times in my life where I was surrounded by so many people who looked like me. And especially in Vancouver, where the black population is less than 1%, this felt really special. I also really wanted to find someone who could do my hair. No offense, Mom. This community was my home. This community was everything, until it wasn't. At the end of my first year, I came out as queer. Well, I changed my relationship status on Facebook to be with a woman and kind of just hoped nobody would notice. But unfortunately, they did. And within days, I was completely ostracized from this community. I didn't understand it. There I was in this ginormous university, isolated, alone, depressed, and confused. So, before I move on with my story, I want to actually clear up a common misconception. I don't want you to walk away from this talk thinking that black communities are inherently homophobic, because that's just not true. The Public Institute for Religion Research actually tells us that all racial groups exhibit equal amounts of homophobia. So what that means is homophobia is not a racial issue, it's a human issue. However, I was really curious to know why sometimes people who are black and part of the LGBTQ community sometimes experience more present forms of discrimination and homophobia within their communities. And what I found was really interesting, and again ties back to some of those histories of slavery and colonization that I talked about in the beginning. Firstly, often black communities and communities of African descent are likely to take more literal interpretations of the Bible. Now, sometimes when we read into it, the Bible might tell us that homosexuality is a sin, depending on your interpretation. And so in some communities, that's really held onto, and therefore homosexuality is sometimes seen as taboo. Secondly, during the periods of slavery and colonization, sexuality was often used as a tool of subjugation. So sexual assault, particularly on female slaves, was used as a way to oppress and subjugate those women. So in generations subsequently, any kind of sexual experimentation or exploration was again seen as a taboo. And thirdly, the concept of emasculation. So another pre-existing stereotype that I think we're all victims to is conflating homosexuality with emasculation. So the idea that gay men are less masculine than heterosexual men. And again, within the periods of slavery and colonization, Black male slaves experienced emasculation to the highest degree. So by having absolutely no power, control, or influence over their own lives, things we often associate with masculinity, they were emasculated. And so in present generations, sometimes what that means is a fear or a stress around the idea of homosexuality. So those are some things that I found really interesting, and I just wanted to bring that to your attention because I don't want people to walk away thinking that Black communities are inherently homophobic. In fact, what's more important to take away from this is how intergenerational trauma and history plays a huge part in how we relate to one another in the present day. So I'm a pretty proactive person, and I thought, well, if I'm not going to be accepted in this community, I need to find another one. I want to find a community where people can accept me for being a queer person. I wanted to meet other queer and trans people, find out more about my identity, learn new words and terms to describe myself, learn more about gender fluidity, and find a space where I could hold my partner's hand without fear of rejection or isolation. So I joined the campus's LGBTQ club. Again, it was great. I had a wonderful time meeting new people, finding other people who were like me. But then, again, after a while, I began to realize that something wasn't quite right. The majority of the people in the group were white, and I was the only Black person, and there were very few other people of color. Now, at face value, not a terrible thing, especially in Vancouver. I'm very used to being the only Black person in a room. But I also began to notice a very subtle and insidious stream of racism that impacted me within that community. People started to ask me questions like, "Don't you wish you had normal hair?" Or, "Are you the janitor?" After a while, I just couldn't take that anymore. Even though I had yearned so much for this community, here I was miles away from home, wanting to connect with people, wanting to find people who are like me. So I left this community. I didn't want to be a part of that anymore. So there I was again, isolated, alone, depressed, and confused. How am I here again? I started to question myself. Why me? What did I do? Why don't people like me? And then, after a while, I thought, I'm kind, I'm funny, I'm hot. Who wouldn't want to be my friend? So it wasn't me. It was how these communities were built. And of course, these people were trying wonderfully hard to create beautiful communities, but something was missing. Luckily, at this time, I learned more about feminism. I started to take gender studies classes in university, much to my father's dismay. And I learned about the concept of intersectionality. Told you I was coming back to it. I learned that Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, a Black feminist legal scholar, created this term to speak about the unique experiences of women who were Black. So people who experienced both sexism and racism, and what it felt like to be at the intersection of those systemic forms of oppression. At this point, I discovered that you can be Black and queer. Mind blown. This was a huge, life-changing moment for me, and now that I think back, it seems so obvious. Of course I can be that, because I am that. That's who I am. But when you receive all these messages, that some people are supposed to be a certain way and other people are supposed to be a certain way. What happens when you're at that intersection? What I needed was a community where intersectionality was the key value, so I could be my full self. So this diagram really kind of illustrates how intersectionality works. It's the overlapping pieces of our identity, but not only that, it's the overlapping ways that systems of oppression interact with one another. So in my example, I was experiencing racism and I was also experiencing homophobia. The weight of both of those made me feel like I had the weight of the world on my shoulders. So I needed a community that valued my whole self. Enter Black Lives Matter. In 2016, I founded the Vancouver chapter of Black Lives Matter, along with some friends and colleagues. So how did I know that Black Lives Matter would be an intersectional community? Well, first of all, because I was in control. Secondly, because it was founded by these three women. Two of these women are queer. All three of them are obviously Black. And for me, this was the first time I had ever seen Black queer women at the forefront of a Black activist movement. We've all heard of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, maybe Marcus Garvey. Amazing people from Black history, but they're all cis, they're all straight, they're all American, and they're all men. Where did I fit in that movement? What if I joined a Black activist movement and it was exactly the same as the first community I was in? When I saw that these three women were crafting a movement that not only applied to racism in America, but racism globally. And when I saw that a chapter started in Toronto, I thought it was perfect that one could also exist in Vancouver. Because despite common misconception, racism does exist in Canada too. So if these three women were creating a movement, I knew for sure I wanted to be part of it. So I have a dream. Intersectionality at the core of communities, where people can be their full selves without fear of rejection or isolation. I can't be the only one having these experiences, and particularly with mental health, sometimes you feel completely alone. You feel like I'm the only one feeling these things, having these struggles. So I did a little bit of research, and I actually found out that being denied community can result in these things: rejection, isolation, depression, anxiety, even homelessness, and risk of violence. In fact, LGBTQ youth in Canada are 8 times more likely to consider suicide than their heterosexual peers. But more than that, the number one reason for this statistic, it's rejection. Rejection from community, from friends, from family, from teachers, causes queer youth, queer and trans youth, to wish that they didn't exist. So I want to explain why I titled this talk, How Black Activists Are Changing Your Communities for the Better. We've already seen how Black activists are changing Black communities, with the rise of more women and queer and trans people being at the forefront of our movements. But what about everybody else? What can we learn from this? How is this taking place in our communities? Well, you may have seen over the past few years that Black Lives Matter chapters have been particularly involved in making pride parades more inclusive. Particular demands have been made of people who are organizing pride parades to make sure that they are more inclusive, better educated, safer, more radical, and more sustainable. You may also have seen this flag. Many people will recognize the red stripe down as the typical LGBTQ pride flag. Over recent years, Black and brown activists have actually requested that flags now have the top 2 lines, a black and brown stripe, to really incorporate how our communities are so diverse. Previously, Black and brown people have felt isolated and excluded from LGBTQ movements. So with the rise of Black activists and Black activist movements that are intersectional, we're able to apply that as a framework to change all of our communities. I believe that the liberation of Black people contributes to the liberation of us all. I also want to create communities where everyone matters. Thank you.